Hey, it's Nathan. Let me ask you something before we start. Have you ever watched a man who refuses to raise his voice and felt more afraid of him than of anybody shouting? There's a reason for that. I keep bees on the weekends, and my neighbor who taught me told me the first day, a hive doesn't panic. When a robber wasp comes to steal the honey, 10,000 workers don't scream and scatter. They go quiet. They read the air. And then, all at once, with no signal you can hear, they move as one, and the robber never leaves. Today's story is about a man exactly like that. His name is Seth Cahill, and he raised bees for a living out in the Arizona desert, and he was the calmest man in every room he ever walked into. His wife's family mistook that calm for weakness. They mistook patience for a man who wouldn't fight. They spent a year building a lie so big it had a coffin in it, and they never once considered what happens when a quiet man finally decides to open the hive. Stay with me to the end, because the way this one turns is going to teach you something about the difference between rage and patience. Rage is a flare. Patience is a current. Here's what happened. The phone rang at 11 minutes past midnight, and Seth Cahill knew before he answered that it was bad, because his brother Gabe never called after 9. Gabe worked the night shift on the border for the United States Border Patrol, out of the Ajo station, and a man who spent his whole career watching the desert learn its own tricks did not waste midnight phone calls on small things. Seth sat up in the dark of the ranch house he'd built with his own hands, careful not to wake the 2 children asleep down the hall, and put the phone to his ear. His brother's voice came through low and flat, the way it got when Gabe was working hard to sound calm and failing at the edges. "Don't drive the kids to school tomorrow," Gabe said. "Stay home. Keep the gate locked. And Seth, whatever you do, don't tell Cordelia your plans anymore. Not the school runs, not the doctor, not the grocery. Nothing. Starting tonight." Seth stood and walked to the kitchen so his voice wouldn't carry. "You're scaring me," he said. "Good," Gabe answered. "Stay scared until I get there. I'm driving up in the morning. Just trust me. Lock everything. Don't sleep too deep." And then he was gone, and Seth stood in his dark kitchen holding a dead phone, listening to the swamp cooler tick and the desert wind push against the glass. He did not go back to sleep. Instead, he did what he always did when the world got loud. He went out to the bees. The apiary sat 200 yards behind the house, 40 white boxes in neat rows under a ramada, and even at midnight he could hear the low collective hum of them settling for the night, the sound that had steadied him through every hard season of his life. Seth Cahill was 41 years old, lean and sun-browned, with the kind of stillness people sometimes found unnerving. He had inherited the operation from his father, Bertram Cahill, a stubborn old man who had spent 30 years breeding a strain of honeybee so resistant to mites and disease that the big agricultural outfits in California would have paid a fortune to own the queens. Bert had died 2 winters back and left the whole thing, the land, the bees, and most of all the genetic line he'd built. The queens the industry now called simply the Cahill line, not to Seth, but in a protected trust to Seth's 2 children. 8-year-old Marigold, whom everyone called Goldie for her hair and for the honey she was named after, and 6-year-old Charlie, who followed his father into the bee yard in a veil 3 sizes too big. Bert had done it that way on purpose, and only now, standing in the dark, did Seth begin to understand exactly what his father had been afraid of. Bert Cahill had never said an unkind word about Marielle out loud, but in the last month of his life, thin and yellow in the hospice bed, he had gripped Seth's wrist with a strength that didn't belong to a dying man, and said a strange thing his son had filed away and never understood. "Watch who visits when the honey comes in. A weak hive gets robbed at the harvest, not in the lean times. Put the good queen somewhere they can't reach her." 2 days later, Bert had changed his will, routing the entire genetic line into the children's trust instead of to Seth, and Seth had been quietly hurt by it, had wondered if his father doubted him. He understood now. Bert had watched the Mars family circle his son's marriage for years and had made the one move that mattered. He had put the good queen somewhere they couldn't reach her, and had trusted that his patient boy would work out the rest when the robbing started. The marriage had not died all at once, the way the county believed it had died on that highway. It had died slowly, over years, in a direction Seth had been too loyal to name. Marielle had loved him once, he was fairly sure of that. Had loved the quiet and the desert and the strange, gentle science of the bees. Back when they were young, and her mother's disapproval had felt like something to rebel against, rather than obey. But Cordelia Mars was a patient robber too, and she had spent a decade whispering to her daughter about the smallness of a beekeeper's life, the dust and the debt, and the man who would rather stand in a field of insects than build anything a person could show off. Somewhere in there, Marielle had started to agree. She had started spending her weeks in the city, then her weekends. She had met Sloan Deverell at one of her mother's fundraisers and found in him everything the desert had taught her to want and nothing the desert had taught her to value. And when the debts her secret life had run up came due, and her mother offered her a way out that was monstrous and clean and would leave her rich and free and rid of the quiet man forever, Marielle Cahill had looked at her sleeping children and decided that she could live without them more easily than she could live without the version of herself her mother had sold her. Seth had known none of this on the night he held her closed casket. He knew all of it now, and the knowing did not make him want to scream. It made him want to be very, very careful, because there was a hole in the middle of Seth's life, and the hole had a name, and the name was Marielle. 14 months earlier, Seth's wife had died. That was the official story, stamped and signed and grieved. Marielle Cahill, 38, had lost control of her car on the Ajo Highway on a black night in June, gone off the shoulder into a wash, and burned. The county medical examiner, a soft, heavy man named Dr. Wystan Lomax, had signed the certificate himself. There had been a small closed casket and a large insurance policy, and Seth had held his 2 crying children at a graveside and believed every word of it, the way you believe the ground is solid until it isn't. He had spent 14 months learning to be a widower. He had learned to braid Goldie's hair badly, to answer Charlie's questions about heaven, to sleep in the middle of a bed that had once had 2 people in it. He had grieved a woman completely, the way you can only grieve someone you think is gone forever. And now his brother was telling him, in the careful voice of a man who has seen something on a government screen he cannot unsee, to lock his doors and trust no one. And Seth felt the first cold finger of a suspicion so ugly he could not yet say it out loud, even to the bees. Marielle had come from money, or from the memory of money. Her family, the Mars, were an old Pima County name, and old Pima County names in that stretch of desert usually meant land, cattle, and something quieter underneath. Cordelia Mars, Marielle's mother, was a tall, elegant woman in her late 60s who wore linen and pearls to a truck stop and spoke to everyone as though she were doing them a courtesy by remembering their name. She owned a company called Sonora Solace, a cross-border repatriation and transport service, a fleet of quiet white vans, and one long black one that carried the sick and the dead back and forth across the line at Lukeville, patients to clinics in Sonora, remains home to families on either side. It was a business built on grief and paperwork and the kind of official trust that lets a vehicle cross an international border without anyone looking too hard in the back. Seth had never liked Cordelia, but he had been polite for Marielle's sake, and after Marielle died, he had let the grandmother back into the children's lives because the children had lost so much already. Cordelia visited every Sunday. She asked about the schedule. She asked about the doctor's appointments, the school pickups, the bank. She asked, Seth realized now, standing among his father's bees at 1 a.m, about everything. Seth walked the rows in the dark and made himself think like his father taught him to think. Bert Cahill used to say that you never open a hive angry, that you smoke it first, that you move slow and you watch, and you let the bees tell you what's true before you decide anything. So Seth did not call Cordelia and scream. He did not call Marielle's brothers, Cash and the older one, and demand answers. He stood very still in the desert night and he listened, and he let the ugly shape of it assemble itself in his mind one piece at a time. His brother had seen something. His wife's family had spent a year knowing his every movement. His children owned a fortune in a locked trust that Cordelia Mars could not touch as long as their father was alive and well and standing between them and her. And somewhere out in the dark, Gabe was driving north toward him at 90 miles an hour, with his headlights off in his mind, terrified of something he hadn't wanted to say on an open phone line. Seth went back inside before dawn. He checked the children, both breathing soft and slow. He loaded his father's old shotgun and set it inside the pantry door, and he made a pot of coffee, and he sat down at the dark kitchen window that looked out over the gravel drive, and he waited for 6 o'clock. Because some part of him already knew that the morning was going to bring something to that driveway that he was going to have to look at with his own eyes. At 2 minutes to 6, with the sky over the Growler Mountains just going the color of a bruise, a van Seth did not recognize came slow up the county road and stopped at the mouth of his drive, exactly where he pulled out every morning to take his children to school. It was white, unmarked, newer than anything his neighbors drove, and it killed its lights and simply sat there, engine running, a plume of exhaust rising in the cold. Seth set down his coffee. Everything in him went quiet and cold and clear. The hive quiet, the reading the air quiet. The van's side door slid open. A figure stepped down onto the gravel and stood, and the weak dawn light fell across a face Seth Cahill had watched them lower into the ground 14 months before. It was Marielle, his dead wife, alive and thinner, and dressed in clothes he didn't know, standing at the end of his driveway in the gray light, looking up at the dark kitchen window, as though she could see him behind the glass. And Seth understood, in one long freezing heartbeat, that his father had been right about everything, that the grief had been a lie sold to him for a year, and that the woman he had buried and mourned had come back at dawn, not alone, and not for her children's love. His blood ran cold, and then, slowly, in the way of a hive when the robber finally shows its face, it went very, very still. Seth did not move from the window. That was the first thing, and it may have been the most important thing, and later, when the federal agents asked him how he'd kept his head, he would tell them the truth. He thought about smoke. When you're about to open a hive that might be angry, you don't yank the lid. You puff cool smoke across the entrance and you wait, and the smoke tells the guard bees a lie. It tells them there's a wildfire, and every worker forgets the intruder and gorges on honey to save it. And in that soft, heavy calm, you can lift the whole roof off their world, and they barely notice. Cordelia Mars had been smoking Seth's hive for 14 months. Every Sunday visit, every gentle question about the schedule, had been a puff of cool smoke to keep him docile, while she lifted the lid off his life. And now here was the reason, standing in his gravel drive. Not a ghost, not a miracle, but a living woman and a plan. And Seth realized that the only advantage he had left in the entire world was that they did not yet know he was awake behind the glass, watching and thinking, and already, quietly, beginning to move. The van sat at the end of the drive for 11 minutes. Seth counted them on the kitchen clock. Marielle never came closer than the mailbox. She just stood and looked, and once she lifted a hand toward the house in a gesture that might have been longing and might have been a signal to someone in the van, and Seth could not tell which, and that not knowing was its own kind of education. At 6:13, the side door slid shut and the van pulled away, unhurried, north toward the highway. Seth wrote down the time. He did not yet know why, but he wrote it down, the way his father wrote down the day a hive superseded its queen. Then he woke the children gently, told them there was no school today because Uncle Gabe was coming to visit, made pancakes so their morning would feel ordinary, and kept his body between them and the windows the entire time, without once letting them see him do it. Gabe arrived at 9, still in half his uniform, gray with no sleep, and the two brothers stood out by the bee yard where the children couldn't hear, and Gabe told him what he had seen on a government computer at 2 o'clock that morning. Border Patrol agents see the crossings. Every legal entry at a port like Lukeville pings a federal system, name and document and photograph, and Gabe had been running a routine watch on the vehicles registered to Sonora Solace because a younger agent had flagged one of Cordelia's vans months ago for crossing too often, too empty, at odd hours. That night, the system had matched a face crossing north on foot at the pedestrian lane to a photograph in a fraud alert file. A woman traveling on a Mexican identity card under the name Mariela Reyes, whose biometric photo the software had quietly, coldly, matched at a 96% confidence to one Marielle Cahill, deceased, of Ajo, Arizona. The computer doesn't know she's supposed to be dead, Gabe said. It just knows it's seen that face before. And when I pulled the death record to make the alert go away, Seth, the medical examiner's file is wrong. The dental match is a photocopy of a photocopy. There was never any real identification of the body. Somebody signed a certificate for a woman who is walking around Sonora on a fake card. He put his hand on his brother's shoulder. She's alive. She's been alive the whole time. And she crossed back into the country 3 weeks ago, and she hasn't gone home to anybody, which means she's here for a reason, and the reason came to your driveway at 6 o'clock this morning. Seth told him about the van. He told him about the 14 months of Sunday visits and gentle questions. And then, standing among his father's 40 humming boxes, the two brothers assembled the ugly shape of it all the way, and it was worse than either of them had let themselves guess. Marielle had not died. Marielle had disappeared, with help, with paperwork, with a coffin and a grieving husband as her alibi, and the help had come from her own mother's business, a business built expressly to move bodies across an international line without anyone looking in the back. The insurance money had paid off debts nobody talked about. But insurance money runs out, and the real prize had never been the policy. The real prize was locked in a trust in the name of 2 children, Bertram Cahill's genetic line, the disease-resistant queens, an inheritance that agricultural buyers had already valued in the millions, and that grew more valuable every year the world's other bees kept dying. Cordelia Mars could not touch a cent of it. No one could. No one except the children's legal guardian. And the children had a living, healthy father standing squarely in the way. Seth was not an obstacle they could buy or charm. He was an obstacle they had to remove. And a family that already knew how to make a person vanish across a border, that owned the vans and the coffins and a bought medical examiner's signature, had looked at the problem of Seth Cahill and seen not a murder, but a logistics job. That was the part that turned Seth's grief into something harder and more useful. They didn't hate him. That was almost the worst of it. To Cordelia Mars, he was a scheduling conflict. The plan, as Seth and Gabe reconstructed it over the following days with a caution that bordered on paranoia, was elegant in the way that only truly cruel things are elegant. A widower, everyone knew, was a fragile creature. 14 months alone in a desert house with 2 motherless children and a dead wife's ghost. Who would be surprised if such a man finally broke? Who would question it if Seth Cahill was found one morning having taken his own life, a note in his own hand, the shotgun that everyone knew he kept by the pantry door? And then a grieving grandmother would step forward, the children's only family, to take them in, and quietly, tearfully, to petition the court for control of their trust for their own care and protection. There would be no body to inconvenience anyone, because the family that would come to help with the arrangements owned a repatriation service, and a man's remains can cross a border in a sealed transport coffin without a single customs officer asking to see his face. Seth Cahill would not be buried. He would be erased, the same way his wife had been, and the same vans would do it, and the same soft, heavy doctor would sign the second certificate as he had signed the first. Marielle's role in it was the wound that would not close, because she was not a prisoner in this. Gabe's contacts and, later, a federal financial investigator would trace it clean. Marielle had left Seth long before she left the world. For 2 years before her death, she had been involved with a man named Sloan Deverell, a smooth, tanned logistics contractor Cordelia had brought into Sonora Solace to modernize the routes, the man who had designed the disappearance, forged the identity card, arranged the border crossings, and who now stood to walk away with a woman freed of her marriage and a fortune freed of its father. Marielle had chosen it. She had sat at Seth's table on the last Sunday of her old life, had kissed her sleeping children, and had climbed into a van and let the world be told she was Ash. The visit to the driveway at dawn, Seth came to understand, had not been love and had not been mercy. It had been reconnaissance, and perhaps a test, of whether the widower was still docile, still smoked, still asleep behind the glass. She had come to look at the hive before they robbed it, and she had gone away believing it was quiet. Seth let her keep believing it. This was the decision that everything else turned on, and it was the most difficult thing he ever did. Every instinct he had screamed to grab his children and run, to call the state police, to stand in Cordelia Mars's genteel living room and howl the truth until the pearls fell off her neck. Gabe wanted to arrest somebody that first week, but Seth had spent his whole life learning that the loud response gives your enemy an exit. Run, and they scatter and regroup and come again when your guard is down, and next time there is no midnight phone call. Accuse them with what he had, a face on a border camera, a suspicious file, and a family with a bought doctor and expensive lawyers would explain it away. would perhaps even turn it around, would paint the unstable widower as a paranoid man making wild claims about his tragically dead wife. No, if Seth wanted his children safe forever, he did not need to frighten the robber off the hive. He needed to let the robber come all the way inside, in front of witnesses, reaching for the honey, and then close the box. He needed them to commit the whole crime in a place where every second was recorded and every player was present, so that when it ended, there would be nothing left to argue about. So Seth Cahill, who had already learned to perform the role of the grieving widower for 14 months, made himself a chilling promise at his kitchen window. He would keep performing it. He would be exactly the broken, lonely, careless man they needed him to be. And while they watched him fall apart, he would quietly build the trap that would swallow all of them at once. The genius of it, and Seth's brother would later shake his head and call it that. Genius, though Seth only ever called it beekeeping, was that Seth already owned everything he needed to turn their own surveillance into a weapon. Cordelia's whole plan depended on knowing his movements, and she got that knowledge from exactly one place, from Seth himself, from the schedule he told her on those Sunday visits. Gabe had said, "Don't tell Cordelia your plans anymore," and Seth understood the deeper move inside that instruction. He would keep telling Cordelia his plans. He would just start telling her the plans he wanted her to believe. If the family was reading his life like a hive, then Seth would do what a clever old beekeeper does when he wants to move a colony without a fight. He would give them a false entrance. He would let Cordelia think she knew exactly where the widower would be and when he would be alone, and he would make sure that the where and the when were a place of his own choosing, wired and watched and surrounded, so that when they finally came to close the deal on his life, they would be walking, all of them, straight into the center of Seth Cahill's own carefully smoked and waiting hive. He started with the tools he already had, because a beekeeper is half scientist and half tinkerer, and Seth had spent years wiring his apiary like a laboratory. To track which of his hives were foraging where, he glued tiny RFID tags to the backs of individual bees and read them with sensors at the hive mouths. To know a colony's health without cracking it open, he watched it through a thermal camera that turned the cluster's heat into a glowing map. He had trail cameras strung across the desert to catch the javelinas and the occasional bear that raided his boxes, motion-triggered, silent, storing weeks of images to little cards. None of this was exotic. It was the ordinary gear of a modern bee operation. But a man who can tag a bee and follow it across 2 miles of desert can tag other things, and a man who reads heat signatures through a hive wall can read them through the wall of a van, and Seth began, patiently, in the dark, to turn his father's science on his wife's family. He did not do anything illegal on their property. Gabe was very clear about that line, and Seth respected it, because evidence gathered wrong is evidence a lawyer erases. He simply started watching, the way he watched everything, and he started writing it all down. He thought about it exactly the way he thought about foragers. When Seth wanted to know where his bees were working, he didn't follow them. He waited at the entrance and let them come to him, and he read the tags and the pollen and built a map of the whole invisible territory from a single fixed point he was allowed to stand on. So he did not chase the Mars vans. He stood at his own fixed points, the public road, his own fence line, Rue's freely given manifests, and he let the pattern come to him. He learned that a Sonora Solace van crossed north empty and came back heavy on the 2nd and 4th Fridays. He learned that the long black transport ran only on moonless nights, and he pulled up a calendar and marked the moonless Fridays in October, like a man marking a nectar flow. He timed the round trip from the border to the packing yards. He noticed, watching heat bloom on his thermal screen out of old habit one evening as a van idled at the crossing, that the empty northbound vehicle ran warm in the cargo box, the way a vehicle does when something living is riding in the back. And he wrote that down too. And months later, a federal analyst would use that same observation to convict. None of it was magic. It was a beekeeper's arithmetic. Patience times observation. Run long enough that the hidden shape of a thing rises up out of the noise on its own. By the time Seth was ready to bait them, he understood the Mars family's operation better than most of the Mars family did, and they never once felt him looking, because he had spent his whole life learning to be the still thing at the edge of the field that the busy creatures forget is even there. The break that turned watching into a case came from inside the family, and it came from the one Mars who could not stomach what the others had done. Her name was Rue, 17 years old, Cash Mars's daughter, a quiet girl who kept the dispatch logs for Sonora Solace after school because her grandmother said it built character. Rue had loved her Aunt Marielle, had cried at the funeral, and had spent a year noticing small, impossible things. A coffee order for a woman who was dead, a phone in her grandmother's desk that only ever received calls from a Sonora number, a coffin manifest that listed a crossing on a night when the family swore no vans had run. She had said nothing because she was a child in a house where you did not ask Cordelia Mars questions. But when Seth Cahill's brother, in uniform, started making careful inquiries around the county, Rue understood that whatever her family was doing had a father and two small cousins on the other end of it, and something in her broke the right way. She reached out to Seth first, terrified, at a feed store parking lot, and told him she thought her aunt was alive. And Seth, who could have used the girl, run her back into that house as a spy, risked her, instead did the thing that told you everything about the difference between him and the people he was fighting. He took her straight to his brother, and then to a federal agent, and he made sure that from that moment on, Rue Mars was protected, on the record, as a witness and not a weapon. The girl had found him at the feed store in Ajo on a Tuesday, and Seth would remember the whole encounter in the too bright detail of a thing your body knows is important before your mind catches up. He was loading 50-pound sacks of sugar into his truck bed when she appeared at the tailgate, 17 and thin and gray-faced, gripping a rolled-up dispatch printout like it might bite her. "Mr. Cahill," she said, and then she couldn't get the rest out, and she started over twice, and finally she said it in one broken rush. "I think Aunt Marielle's alive. I think Grandma did something, and I think it's about you. And I didn't know who else could." And then she was crying in the parking lot, 17 years old and carrying a secret 3 sizes too big for her. And Seth's whole clever plan bent for a moment around the simple fact of a frightened child. He did not press her for the papers. He did not ask her a single question about the routes or the manifests, though he wanted them more than he had ever wanted anything. He walked her to the shade of the store's awning, and he said, "You did the bravest thing you'll ever do just now, and you're not going to do anything else brave alone. We're going to call my brother, and then we're going to talk to a woman I trust, and from this minute on you are not in this by yourself." He would not let Rue go back into that house wearing a wire, no matter how much faster it would have made the case, because she was somebody's kid, and Seth Cahill had spent his whole life on the principle that you do not use up the young to save yourself. Ruiz fought him on it for a day and then stopped, because she saw what Seth saw, that the manifests Rue had already copied, given freely, from a girl the family would never suspect, were cleaner evidence than anything a wire could catch, and that protecting her was not only decent, but smart. It usually is. That is the other thing the bees teach you, that a colony survives by protecting the ones who can't yet forage, and the hives that eat their young do not last the winter. The federal agent was Camila Ruiz, a Homeland Security Investigations special agent out of Tucson who had spent a decade unwinding exactly this kind of cross-border fraud, and who understood, the moment Gabe laid it out for her, that she was looking at something rare. Not just a faked death, but a whole quiet machine that faked them. A repatriation company that had learned it could move a living person out and a looted estate's worth of value back, over and over, under the cover of grief. Because Marielle Cahill, it turned out, was not the first. Ruiz's team, following the manifests Rue quietly copied, found the Science file. Guillermo Science, a widower rancher from Y, Arizona, who had died 3 years earlier of a heart attack certified by Dr. Wistan Lomax, whose small estate had been drained by a helpful family friend, and whose grown children had never been allowed to see the body before Sonora Solace carried it south for a burial in the old country that no relative down there could ever quite locate. There were others, fainter in the paper, older. Cordelia Mars had not built a business. She had built a way to make inconvenient people disappear and their money reappear, dressed up as compassion, stamped and legal and sealed in the back of a van. Camila Ruiz was a small, unhurried woman with a flat calm that Seth recognized on sight, the calm of someone who has learned that the loud cases fall apart and the quiet ones convict. She met the brothers first in the back room of a Tucson field office, and listened without writing anything down. And when Gabe finished, she asked exactly one question: who signed the death certificate? And when they said the name Wisten Lomax, she leaned back and closed her eyes for a second, like a woman who has just heard the last number in a combination she's been turning for years. Lomax was already a shadow on her desk. A county medical examiner who certified an unusual number of deaths that traveled south of the border for burial. A man whose signature, it turned out, was the single load-bearing beam under the whole Sonora Solace enterprise. You cannot fake a death without a doctor to call it real. Cordelia Mars had not built her machine out of vans and coffins. She had built it out of one corruptible man with a pen, and everything else was just logistics. The science file was the one that made it personal for Ruiz's whole team, and it was the one Seth asked to see, because he needed to know he was not imagining the size of what he was fighting. Guillermo Sáenz had been a widower too, a rancher out past Y, with 40 acres and 2 grown children, and a bad heart that Dr. Lomax had certified stopped him one August night 3 years back. There had been no viewing. Sonora Solace had handled everything, so kindly, so promptly, and carried him south for a burial that his daughter Estella had spent 2 years and most of her savings failing to locate, because there was no grave, because there had very likely never been a death, only a man who had become inconvenient to the same helpful family friend who had somehow ended up with power of attorney over his land. Seth met Estella Sáenz once, before the trap, in Ruiz's office, and the woman looked at him and said, "You still have a chance to stop it while your children still have you." She did not have that chance. Her father was gone into the desert somewhere, and the paperwork said he had died of natural causes and been lovingly laid to rest, and no one had ever looked in the back of the van. Seth walked out of that meeting and sat in his truck for a long time, and whatever small hesitation had still lived in him about the hardness of what he was about to do to his wife's family died there, quietly, and did not come back. And now Seth held the thread that could unravel all of it, if he could get them to reach for one more honeypot with everyone watching. So he baited the hive. Over the next 3 weeks, Seth Cahill performed the slow public unraveling of a broken man, and he performed it for an audience of 1. On the Sunday visits, which he kept exactly as always so nothing would seem to change, he let Cordelia see the whiskey he didn't drink, the unshaven jaw, the way he stared out the window when the children mentioned their mother. He confided, haltingly, that the bank was pressuring him, that the bee business was failing without his father, that he'd been thinking of selling the whole operation and the land and moving away, and he watched the flicker in Cordelia Mars's eyes when he said it, the flicker of a woman calculating that her window was closing, that if the trust's asset was sold or moved, she might lose her grip on it forever. He mentioned, as if in passing, that his brother had transferred to a post down near the Texas line, that he'd be all alone out at the far outyard the following Friday night, doing the fall requeening, the one weekend of the year a beekeeper works past dark and tells no one where he'll be. He drew them a map without ever drawing a map. He gave them a lonely man, a closing window, and a remote location on a moonless night where the widower would be entirely, conveniently alone. He gave Cordelia Mars the false entrance, and he watched her walk toward it, and he never once let the smoke of his performance thin enough for her to smell how awake he really was. There was one Sunday in particular that Agent Ruiz later called the finest piece of undercover work she'd seen from a civilian, though Seth only ever thought of it as opening a hive slow. Cordelia came at 4, as she always did, in her linen and her pearls, and Seth had spent an hour before she arrived, making the house tell her story for him. A bill-stamped final notice left where she would see it, a bottle on the counter with 3 fingers gone that he'd poured down the sink, the good coffee replaced with the cheap kind a man buys when the money's tight. He met her unshaven. He let the silences run a beat too long. And Cordelia Mars, who read a room the way Seth read a colony, sat at his kitchen table and went to work with her gentle little probes, and Seth let each one land. "You look tired, dear. Are you sleeping?" "Not really," he admitted. "The children mention you've been talking about the coast." He shrugged and looked out the window and said, maybe it was time for a change, that the outyards were more than one man could run, that his father's bees might be worth more sold than kept. He watched her hands when he said the word sold. He watched the pearl at her throat move as she swallowed. And he saw, plain as a queen cell on a frame, the thing he had baited her to show him, fear. Not grief for a struggling son-in-law, fear that the asset was about to slip her grasp. She set down her cup and said, so warmly it turned his stomach, "You mustn't make any big decisions alone, Seth. Family is for exactly these moments. Let me help you carry it." And Seth Cahill lowered his eyes like a broken man grateful for a hand, and said, "Thank you, Cordelia. I don't know what the children and I would do without you." And underneath the table, where she couldn't see, his hands were perfectly still. The hardest part was the children, because he could not tell them, and they were the whole reason. Goldie had started asking, the way 8-year-olds do, sharp questions at bedtime. Why they went to Aunt Junie's in the city now, why Daddy checked the doors twice, why Uncle Gabe's voice on the phone was different. Charlie just wanted to be in the bee yard, and Seth let him, because a boy in a veil handing his father frames was a boy who felt safe, and Seth would have burned the world down before he let either of them feel the cold thing that had crawled into their lives. So he lied to his children the only way he could stand to. He made the days ordinary, and he made himself the still center of them. And at night, after they were asleep, he drove out to meet a federal agent in a gas station parking lot and became, for 2 hours, the sharp and tireless man that no one in the Mars family would have recognized. He carried both versions of himself at once for 3 weeks without cracking. The grieving fool the enemy needed, and the patient hunter his children needed. And if you want to know what love actually looks like, stripped of the greeting card version, it looks like a man holding 2 faces steady in the dark, so that a robber will reach all the way into the box. The far-out yard was Elmore Tice's place, 40 acres of mesquite and abandoned citrus that had belonged to the old beekeeper who taught Seth's father, a man in his 80s now who still kept 100 hives out there and who loved Seth like a grandson. It sat down a single dirt road with one way in, backed against a dry wash, with an old packing shed at its center. And it was, Agent Ruiz agreed the moment she saw it, a nearly perfect box. One road to watch, clear sight lines, a structure to wire. Federal ground for a warrant to stand on. Once Seth, as the property's invited guest and a target of the conspiracy, consented to every camera and microphone they cared to hang. For a week, Ruiz's people turned the packing shed and the dirt road into an instrument. They set cameras where Seth told them the trail cams would naturally go, so that even a careful man walking the ground would see nothing new. They positioned agents in the wash and behind the mesquite. Border Patrol, through Gabe, quietly closed the informal crossing the Sonora Solace vans had been using, so that when the family came for Seth, their only route home would be one Ruiz controlled. It almost came apart twice, because plans always do, and both times it was Seth's stillness and not the federal machinery that held it together. The first was Cash. 3 days before the outyard, Cash Mars got drunk and suspicious and drove out to the ranch unannounced at dusk, and he found Seth in the bee yard and stood too close and asked too many pointed questions. Where the kids were, why the house was dark, whether Seth had talked to anybody. A frightened man would have fumbled it. Seth just kept working the frames, unhurried, and told Cash a soft, true-sounding lie about the children being at their aunt's while he sorted out the sale. And then he did the thing that ended it. He handed Cash a lit smoker and asked him to hold it. And Cash, who was terrified of the bees like most people who aren't beekeepers, took 2 steps back and lost his nerve and his line of questioning both, and left. Seth watched his taillights go and then leaned against the truck and let his hands shake, once, privately, before he put them back to work. The second was worse, and it was Marielle. On the Thursday, the day before, she broke the discipline of her own family's plan and drove past Junie's house in the city where the children were hidden. Ruiz's people caught her on the street camera, idling, watching the door. Whether it was a mother's last flicker of feeling or just a final check to make sure the kids were where the family expected them, no one would ever know. But for 1 hour that Thursday afternoon, Seth Cahill came the closest he came to abandoning the entire plan, because the only thing his patience had never been able to armor was the thought of that woman anywhere near his children. Ruiz talked him down over the phone in the gas station lot, quietly, the way you'd talk to a man on a ledge. If we move now, we get her for a parole-level fraud and she's out in a few years and she comes back. If we hold, we get all of them, forever, tomorrow night. Hold. And Seth held. He drove to Junie's and sat on the floor of the dark bedroom between his sleeping children and the window until dawn. Awake, still, a father standing guard over the last long night, and in the morning he kissed them and drove out to build the box. And Seth, because he was who he was, added one thing of his own that no federal planner would have thought of, and that Elmore Tice grinned at like a boy when Seth explained it. He moved his angriest hives, the hot ones, the defensive Africanized cross colonies every desert beekeeper keeps a few of and handles only in full armor after dark, and he set them, quiet and smoked and sleeping, in a ring around the packing shed, in the dark, exactly where a man springing an ambush would run. Friday came, and it was moonless, as Seth had promised them it would be. He kissed his children goodnight at his sister-in-law's house far away in the city, where Ruiz had moved them under another name, and he drove out alone to Elmore Tice's outyard in the last of the light and made himself, one final time, into bait. He lit a lantern in the packing shed. He moved around inside it slowly, a lonely man doing lonely work, and he waited, and he was not afraid, because fear is what happens when you don't know what comes next, and Seth had known what came next for 3 weeks. At 11:40, the trail sensors at the top of the dirt road woke, and 2 vehicles came down it with their lights off, a white van, and behind it, the long black transport van, the one built to carry the dead across the line. They had brought the coffin. That detail, when Ruiz's recordings played it back in a federal courtroom a year later, was the thing the jury could not get past. They had brought the coffin with them, empty, to carry Seth Cahill home in. The van stopped. Doors opened in the dark. And the whole poisoned family stepped out into Seth Cahill's waiting hive. Cordelia in her linen, unhurried. Cash with a pistol. Sloane Deverell with a folder of papers and a widower's forged suicide note already typed. And last, hanging back by the black van, Marielle, come to watch her husband erased so that her new life could finally begin. What happened next took 90 seconds, and Seth Cahill did not fire a shot. He stepped out of the shed into the lantern light with his hands loose at his sides, and he let Sloane Deverell start his practice speech about how it didn't have to be hard, and he let Cash raise the pistol, and he let Cordelia Mars say the words that finished her. Words Ruiz's microphones caught clean. He was always going to break eventually. We're only helping it along. And then Seth Cahill did the only violent thing he did all night. He reached down, in the dark, to the row of sleeping boxes at his feet, and he kicked the lids off the hot hives and dragged a smoker across their entrances backward. The one thing you must never do. The thing that turns 10,000 guard bees from calm to fury in a single second. The desert night came alive with a sound like the earth itself growling. Cash fired once, wild, into the dark, and then he was screaming and running and firing at nothing, and Sloane Deverell went down clawing at his own face, and Cordelia Mars, who had spent her whole life certain that she was the one who could not be touched, stood frozen in the center of a rage she could not charm or schedule or pay off, as the swarm she had never once considered rose up around her ankles. And out of the wash and the mesquite, on Ruiz's signal, came the other swarm, the one with badges and lights and lawful warrants, 10,000 quiet workers of a different kind moving all at once, and they closed the box on the whole family in the middle of the crime, with the coffin still open and the note still in Sloane's hand, and every word of it recorded. The trial, when it finally came the next year, was almost an anticlimax, because there was nothing left to argue. Seth sat in the gallery every day, quiet in a clean shirt, and watched the machine his patience had built do its work without him having to lift a hand. The recordings played. Cordelia Mars's own voice filled the courtroom. We're only helping it along. And Seth watched the jurors' faces change the way a field changes when a cloud moves off it. Rue testified from behind a screen and did not once look at her grandmother, and told the truth in a steady voice that Seth was more proud of than he'd have been of anything he'd done himself. Estella Syons sat 2 rows back and finally, at long last, heard a federal prosecutor say her father's name out loud as a victim of a crime and not a line on a burial manifest. When the medical examiner Lomax took his plea, the last beam of the whole rotten structure went out from under it, and Seth felt no rush of triumph, only the deep, tired quiet of a man who has gotten a heavy hive through a hard winter and can finally set down the smoker. Cordelia never looked at him, not once, the whole trial. He thought that was fitting. She had never really looked at him. That had been the entire flaw in her plan. The unspooling, after that, was fast, the way a hive comes apart once you remove its queen. Cordelia Mars, held on federal charges, conspiracy to commit murder, faked death and insurance fraud, forging federal border documents, running a criminal enterprise through Sonora Solace, was the queen, and with her gone the rest of the colony had nothing to organize around and turned on each other for mercy. Cash Mars, nursing 40 stings and a great deal of self-pity, gave up the crossing routes and the buried scions money within a day. Sloan Deverell, who loved himself far more than he had ever loved Marielle, traded every detail of the forgery for a lighter sentence, and in doing so buried her completely. Dr. Wystan Lomax lost his license before his trial and his freedom shortly after. The certificates he'd signed for cash reopened 3 cold cases and gave the scions children, at long last, the truth and a measure of restitution. And Marielle, who had let her own children believe her burned to ash, who had come to a driveway at dawn to make sure the man she'd chosen to erase was still asleep. Marielle went to a federal prison for a long time, convicted of the fraud she'd built her disappearance on and the conspiracy she'd come back to finish. And Seth Cahill did not go to see her, not once, and did not let her near the children, and the court agreed. The trust was made safe. The Cahill line, his father's life's work, passed cleanly to Goldie and Charlie with their father as its guardian, exactly as old Bert Cahill had schemed it in his stubborn wisdom to be. And Rue Mars, the one good bee in a rotten hive, was taken in by Seth's own sister and finished high school in the city, and comes out to the bee yard some weekends still, in a veil 3 sizes too big, to help her small cousins tend the boxes that her family once came in the dark to steal. I want to tell you the last picture, because it's the one that stays with me. Months after the arrests, Nathan. They held the harvest at the home apiary, the first one since everything, and Seth let Goldie and Charlie work the extractor, while old Elmore Tice told lies about the size of the swarm that night, and the whole yard smelled of warm wax and desert honey. And Seth Cahill stood at the edge of it, calm as he had ever been, and watched his children laugh, and he was not thinking about his wife at all. That's the part I keep turning over. Here's what this story taught me, and I think it's true whether or not you'll ever go near a beehive. The world is full of people who mistake a quiet man for a weak one. They see calm and they read surrender. They see patience and they think they've got all the time in the world. But calm isn't the absence of danger. Sometimes calm is danger holding perfectly still, reading the air, waiting for you to reach all the way inside before it moves. Cordelia Mars spent 14 months smoking a hive she thought was asleep, and the whole time the hive was awake, counting, remembering, choosing the ground. Rage would have gotten Seth killed. Rage would have scattered them, and warned them, and armed their lawyers. It was patience that closed the box. Patience, and love, and a father who understood that the strongest thing you can do for the people who depend on you is not to explode, but to stay standing, stay quiet, and refuse to move until you can move all at once. Rage is a flare, and it burns out, and it lights up your own position while it does. Patience is a current. It doesn't stop, and it doesn't announce itself. And by the time you feel it, it has already decided where you're going to end up. Thanks for staying to the end with me. If Seth's story got to you the way it got to me, do me a favor. Sit with that one line before you scroll on. The quietest person in the room is not always the safest one to underestimate. I'm Nathan. Take care of your people, and I'll see you in the next one.